This is a sewing tutorial for the Charlotte dress View A. It's a simple dress with a centre front button placket. It has a straight gathered skirt with inseam pockets. The hem is clean finished and the armholes and the neckline are finished with a self-bias binding. This is just a picture of View B here, which I won't be covering in this video. It's exactly the same except it has added ruffle at the hem and the armholes. Okay, so for View A, first thing to do is to iron the interfacing onto the centre front edges. Now we want to iron the interfacing onto the wrong side of the fabric, and then we will sew on the darts. So what I'm doing here is lining up the nicks at the side seam, and I'm finding the dot to mark the apex of the dart, and I'm just sewing a straight line between them. Now we're going to fold the dart towards the waist edge and secure it at the side seam. So we just want to secure it no more than 6mm or 1/4 of an inch away from that side edge, and just showing you the finished dart. Now if you do find darts tricky to sew in, sometimes it is hard depending on your fabric to sew straight. A little trick is to just mark a straight line either with tailor's chalk or a water erasable pen, and then you'll sew straight onto that line and it's much easier. Okay, so I'm just securing the dart at the side edge again, and that's so that it's pointing the correct way and it doesn't get all scrunched up when we come to close the side seams. And the next step here is to sew in the front plackets. So I've been over to the iron, I've ironed the raw edge in 1cm or 3/8 of an inch, and then I've folded it and ironed it again, this time 2.5 centimeters, which is 1 inch. And then I've just edge stitched along that inside edge there, and then we have a nice neat placket. Okay, just showing you the finished plackets now. And now we're going to join the shoulder seams. So with right sides together, I'm putting the front bodices on top of the back bodice, and I'm going to sew the shoulder seams 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Okay, over at the machine, 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, and just doing the other shoulder now. Then I'm going to go over to the overlocker and just overlock those seams closed and press the seams towards the back. Okay, just showing you the shoulder seams now, and I have ironed those shoulder seams towards the back of the garment. The next step is to sew on the neck binding. So I've got a self-bias binding here, which is cut exactly to the pattern piece. Now the pattern piece is the same length as the neckline, and depending on your fabric you may need a little bit less. I'm using a very, very soft antique finish linen, which is very stretchy on the bias, so I actually don't need quite as much binding as the full pattern piece. So I'm just trimming it at the centre front edge there, just using a couple of pins to put it in place. I have the right side of the binding facing out, and I'm going over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew the binding on with a 1/4 of an inch or 6mm seam. It's extremely important not to stretch the bodice out at this stage. We want to make sure that we're always watching what the grain line is doing of the bodice. Once we stretch that bias out, we will be stretching the neck edge and it will go all wavy and fluty and it won't sit nice on the body. And when I come to that centre front edge, I'm just folding the binding in 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch before I stitch across, and that just leaves a nice clean finish at the centre front edge. And I'm going back to the other side, the left hand side of the garment, and finishing that off. I do find it's easier to start at the centre back and go out rather than start at one end and go right round, but you can do whatever's easy for you. Again, the main message here is do not stretch that neck edge as you sew. If you've got really shifty fabric, you may actually want to stay stitch before you even put the binding on. And what I'm doing here is I'm just folding the garment in half to make sure that the left and right side are the same length. So I haven't stretched one side of the garment. Okay, and back at the machine, what I'm doing here is I'm understitching that seam, which means I'm stitching through the binding and through the seam allowance, quite close to the seam. And this just helps the binding roll towards the inside of the garment, which will become really important when we come to top stitch the binding. And I'm not doing any ironing at this stage. It's actually easier if you don't iron it flat before you stitch. And I've just come to the centre front edge there. Okay, and now I am just trimming back a little bit of that seam allowance at the centre front. Domestic sewing machines aren't that great at sewing over lots of thicknesses of fabric, so it helps to just, it's called grading the seam, when you just trim a little bit back so that you don't get one big fat lump. Okay, so what I'm doing here is top stitching the binding. So I'm stitching approximately 8 millimeters away from the neck edge, which is a bit less than 3/8 of an inch. And I am again taking care not to stretch out that neckline. I'm making the binding do all the work for me here. The reason we use bias cut binding is because it's very stretchy, it's very flexible, and we can make it go around a curve, whereas the garment, we do not want to stretch out those bias parts. And I'm just trimming back a little bit of that seam allowance if I need to. And just coming to the edge here, poking any little bits in and back tacking at the edge. So bias binding does take a little bit of practice, like any new skill. And here I'm showing you one side of the garment I have pressed and the other side I have not. So the power of a steam iron. You can see that one edge was quite wavy and the other edge looked quite perfect. So definitely go over to the iron and spend the time to press the binding. It just makes such a difference. And just showing you a close-up here of the finished neckline. And it looks pretty neat. Okay, and now we can start on the armhole binding. So I've just laid the garment on the table with that armhole nice and flat. And I'm just checking that the binding is going to fit the armhole. If it's a little bit long because you've got quite stretchy, your fabric is stretchy on the bias, then you can just trim it back. If you've got quite compact weave fabric, like a cotton poplin, you may find that you need every single millimeter of that binding. Okay, so I'm really doing exactly the same as I did for the neckline, except that I haven't folded the start and finish in. I don't need a neat finish, excuse me, under the armhole, because we're going to close that seam later. So I've just sewn a 1/4 of an inch seam, or 6 millimeters, and now I'm folding the binding over that stitch line and I'm understitching. So I'm sewing close to the seam, about 1 or 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, and I'm catching the seam allowance underneath. And that's going to help that binding just roll really neatly towards the inside of the garment. And while I'm here, I'm just going to do the other armhole as well. You may notice I'm not really using pins. I actually find it a lot easier to sew binding without pins. The reason for that is if you've pinned the garment together and then you go over to the sewing machine, you're distracted by making everything fit what you've pinned together. Whereas if you just sort of use the force, so to speak, and you're not really having pins in the way, and you're just concentrating on not stretching out the armhole, I find you do a better job. But you can do whatever you find comfortable. Some people are used to sewing binding on using pre-folded binding that they've bought, and that's also fine. That's a slightly different method, which I'll cover in a future binding specific video, but this is the method that professionals use, and it doesn't require any pre-folding, and it's fast, or faster. Okay, so now we're going to close the side seams. So I've got right sides of the front and back bodice together, and I'm sewing a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. And while I'm here, I'm doing the other side of the bodice, so a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch. Now, before I go and overlock those seams, I'm just going to, with my scissors, I'm going to clip into the binding seam allowance so that I can overlock it with the seam open, and that's going to make a big difference when you come to top stitch that armhole binding. You can have an open seam at the binding and the rest of the side seam is actually closed. And here I am just top stitching that binding. So again, it's about 8 millimeters away from the armhole edge, which is a bit less than 3/8 of an inch. And you really want to concentrate on getting an even top stitch from the armhole edge. It doesn't matter as much to be even to the edge of the inside edge of the binding. That doesn't really matter because it's not on the outside of the garment. So you're better off concentrating on an even top stitch away from the armhole edge. Okay, and just back tacking at the underarm there. That's quite a nice, neat finish. And we don't have a lot of bulk under the arm because I have opened that binding seam. And the reason we only do a 6 millimeter seam in the first step, when we sew the binding onto the armhole, is because we don't need to trim that seam back when we come to do the top stitching. And in garment manufacturing, there's no trimming, or very little trimming. It's just a more professional and faster method. Again, there is no right or wrong. If you're used to doing it a different way, by all means do that. Okay, and just showing you the finished armhole binding here. And of course I've been over to the iron and I've given it a good steam press there. Makes a huge difference just to steam that armhole flat. Okay, so next we're going to just pin up the front placket. I've put the right bodice on top of the left bodice and just stitched across the bottom of the placket to keep it together. And now we're moving on to the skirt. So I've got the front skirt with the right side up. I've got the wrong side of the top pocket bag face down. I have chosen to cut the top pocket bag in a cotton voile because self fabric, my fabric is slightly sheer, so I don't want the checks to sort of strike through the fabric, so I've just used a plain cotton voile. Now I've sewn in at the nicks a centimetre, I've pivoted, I've gone down to the next nick and sewn back out, and here I'm just cutting into the corners with my snips. I've folded the pocket bag over the stitch line and I'm just understitching that seam just between the necks there, and that will help the pocket bag just roll towards the inside of the pocket neatly. And do exactly the same for both pockets. Just make sure you've got your pockets the right way up. You can tell the top of the waist edge of the skirt because it's got a neck in the center. Okay, and I've just overlocked that seam allowance because my fabric is a little bit loose weave and it frays. So I've just pressed that pocket mouth, and if you find that it's a bit puckered in the corners there, just go back and snip into the corner a little bit further. That's probably why it's not turning neatly. Okay, so I've put the bottom pocket bag face down onto the top pocket bag, so that right sides are together, and I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam all around that curved edge. And I am using pins this time because everything's kind of on the bias and it all moves around quite a lot, so it's definitely helpful just to pin that in place. Okay, so that was a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam all around the pocket bag. Then I'm going to overlock that pocket bag. And I'm going to give it a good press. Now we just need to secure the sides of the pocket bag. I'm showing you there, just so that it doesn't flap around and get all scrunched up when we come to close the side seams. So no more than, say, 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, because we don't want it to show after we've done a 1 centimetre seam. So I've put both pocket bags in now, and I'm putting the right side of the back skirt on top of the right side of the front skirt. So right sides together, and I'm just going to sew a 1 centimetre seam along the sides. Now, as you go past the pocket mouth, you definitely need to take care not to sew over the edge of the pocket, otherwise you will not be able to use the pockets. So you may just need to move that pocket mouth out of the way as you sew past it. And I just like to do a little back tack at the start and finish of the pocket mouth, and that just gives it the pocket opening a little bit more strength. Okay, so overlock those side seams, and here I'm just showing you the finished pocket. So as you can see, I didn't bother matching my pocket bag checks, and I should have, because it doesn't look very good. At least I managed to match the side seams. Okay, so we have closed side seams, and now we're going to sew the hem. I've gone over to the iron and I've just pressed the hem edge up 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. And now I'm measuring 5 centimetres, which is 2 inches, and I'm just going to put a couple of pins in to secure that. And this job is a little bit easy with this fabric because I have checks, 1 centimetre checks. So it's really easy for me to tell where 5 centimetres is. You may want to put a few more pins in or even iron the 5 centimetres before you go over to the machine. And I'm sewing quite close to the folded edge there, about 2 millimetres away or 1/8 of an inch. Okay, that's the finished hem, which you can now give a really good press. Now this is the waist edge of the skirt, and I have set my stitch length to a longer stitch. This will become our gathering stitch, and you may notice I've started and stopped at both of the side seams, and that is because it really helps to control those gathers if you can pull your gathering stitch on at both sides rather than right the way around. Okay, I'm just showing you the gathering stitch now. And we can now join the bodice to the skirt. So with right sides together, I am matching the centre front neck of the skirt with the centre of the front placket. I'm matching up the side seams, and I'm matching up the centre back neck of the bodice and the skirt. Then we're going to use those gathering stitches and gather the skirt to fit the bodice. So it's important to get nice even spread of fabric along that waist seam. So just take your time at this stage to make sure that the gathers are as even as possible. Then we will head over to the machine and sew a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm using my snips here to squash those gathers down and make sure that they don't sort of pucker and distort and shift around, and make sure that they're kind of pointing, those gathers are pointing quite straight. Gathering, like any skill, practice makes perfect. And there are different methods for gathering. Some people, I notice, like to do 2 rows of gathering stitch. I tend to just use the more professional method, which is more often just 1 gathering stitch, and you just control those gathers as you're sewing around, and I find that easy enough. Okay, so that's a 1 centimetre seam, or 3/8 of an inch, and just the aim there is to get really nice even gathers. I've overlocked that waist seam and pressed the seam upwards, and here you can see we are almost finished. We're just going to mark in the buttonhole position. So if you start the bottom button 3 centimetres up from the waist, which is, what is that? It must be 1 1/4 inches, and the top buttonhole sits just below the binding, or 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch below the centre front neck edge. I've just used my snips to cut into the buttonholes, and I'm just hand sewing on buttons because my sewing machine does not like sewing buttons very securely. Given my skirt, my dress a final press, and now we're finished. So nice and tidy here, and it's pretty simple. I believe a beginner or advanced beginner could tackle this dress quite easily. View B is a bit more tricky, hence why I've called it an intermediate, and I will cover that in a later video. Thanks so much for watching. Head over to my Etsy store to view this listing.